Have you ever felt the icy grip of fear, a moment so intense that it burns itself into your memory forever? Today, we're delving into a chilling childhood experience that still haunts the storyteller to this day. Imagine being young, carefree, exploring the countryside, when suddenly, reality twists into something unrecognizable. A moment when logic ceases to exist, and an invisible force steps in to decide your fate. This is not fiction. This is a true account, as terrifying as it is unexplainable. It begins innocently enough, with an old bicycle and a dirt road, but quickly spirals into a nightmarish encounter. The protagonist recalls every detail with eerie clarity. The golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the dusty trails, the rhythmic squeak of the bicycle's worn-out wheels, and the oppressive silence that seemed to settle as the story unfolded. Little did they know, this ride would lead them straight into the unknown, a brush with something far beyond comprehension. The storyteller sets the stage vividly, their voice trembling as they recount the events. It was supposed to be a normal summer day, a simple bike ride through the countryside. But in hindsight, it feels like fate had been waiting for this very moment, orchestrating the perfect storm of terror. The day started off bright, warm, and full of life, but as the evening wore on, an unsettling tension crept into the air. It was as if the world itself had shifted, and the protagonist was about to step into a nightmare they would never forget. This story is more than just a childhood memory. It's a glimpse into the eerie, the unexplained, and the terrifying. Prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown, as we uncover what happened to Jacob on that fateful day. Before we continue, a quick warning: this story is not for the faint of heart. If you're fascinated by true accounts of the mysterious and the terrifying, make sure to subscribe to Sinister Stories and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear will challenge what you believe about reality. And remember, some truths are scarier than any fiction. Now, let's begin. The story unfolds in a secluded stretch of countryside, far removed from the comforting hum of city life. The kind of place where silence feels heavier, where even the wind seems to carry whispers of secrets best left unspoken. The day was winding down, the golden hues of the setting sun bathing the landscape in an eerie glow. The air was thick with the scent of earth and dry grass, but there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible tang of iron, like the remnants of a storm that never came. Jacob had spent the day wandering the property, a sprawling farmland bordered by dense woods on one side and a narrow, winding road on the other. The barn, an aging skeleton of wood and rusted nails, stood ominously at the heart of the land. Inside, shadows stretched long and dark, creeping across forgotten tools and decaying bales of hay. It was there he found the bike, an old rusted contraption with no brakes, leaning against a wall as if it had been waiting for him. The bike was peculiar, its faded red paint chipped away to reveal patches of dull, corroded metal. The handlebars were cold to the touch, colder than they should have been in the summer heat. Jacob hesitated for a moment, a strange unease prickling at the back of his neck. But curiosity won out. He wheeled the bike out into the open air, unaware of the silent watchers hidden in the shadows of the barn, their presence felt but unseen. As he mounted the bike and began pedaling, the world seemed to grow quieter. The usual sounds of the countryside, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, faded into an oppressive silence. The only sound was the rhythmic creak of the bike's wheels as they rolled over the uneven dirt path. Jacob noticed the air felt heavier now, almost suffocating, and a strange chill crept up his spine despite the warm evening sun. He pushed forward, the path narrowing as it sloped downhill. To his left, the dense woods loomed, their twisted branches forming claw-like shapes against the darkening sky. To his right, the road appeared like a jagged scar cutting through the land, bordered by an old barbed wire fence. Jacob's heart began to race, not from exertion, but from a growing sense of unease that seemed to tighten its grip on him with every turn of the pedals. Then, he noticed something peculiar: the shadows. They moved unnaturally, stretching and shifting in ways that defied the setting sun. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, watching him, following him. Jacob glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see someone, anyone, on the path behind him, but there was no one there. Only the lingering sensation of being observed, of unseen eyes piercing through the dense silence. The descent grew steeper, the bike gaining speed faster than he could control. Jacob's unease turned to outright fear as he realized the brakes were useless. He tried to slow himself by dragging his feet along the ground, but the bike continued its relentless charge downhill. The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, narrowing as the road and fence loomed closer. And then he saw it, the barbed wire, gleaming menacingly in the fading light, a deadly trap at the bottom of the hill. The air grew colder still, and Jacob felt a presence around him, pressing in from all sides. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. The bike rattled violently beneath him, the handlebars shaking as if pulled by unseen hands. Jacob's grip tightened, his knuckles white with terror, as the sense of dread reached a fever pitch. The setting was no longer just a countryside road. It had become a stage for something far darker, something that defied reason. Jacob's instincts screamed at him to jump off the bike, to abandon the ride before it was too late, but he couldn't. It was as if some invisible force had taken hold of him, keeping him locked in place. All he could do was hurtle forward, toward the fence, toward the unknown, toward whatever awaited him at the bottom of the hill. And that's when he heard it, the voice. Far off, yet impossibly clear, it called his name. Not with urgency, but with a chilling calmness that seemed to echo through the very fabric of the air. It was a voice he didn't recognize, yet it felt disturbingly familiar, as though it had always been there, waiting for this exact moment. The voice sent an icy shiver down Jacob's spine. It was faint but deliberate, cutting through the eerie silence like a dagger. It called his name again, this time softer, almost coaxing. Jacob's hands trembled on the handlebars as he craned his neck to look behind him. Nothing. The empty path stretched out, the fading sunlight casting long jagged shadows over the dirt. Yet the feeling of being watched clung to him, oppressive and suffocating. The bike's wheels rattled against the uneven ground as it picked up speed, the slope now steeper than it had seemed moments ago. Jacob's heartbeat thundered in his ears, competing with the unnerving sound of the bicycle's old chain grinding with each rotation. It felt alive, as if the bike itself was determined to propel him toward the fence, toward a crash he couldn't avoid. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. The warm summer air was replaced by a bone-chilling cold that wrapped around him like icy fingers. Jacob's breath puffed out in clouds, the kind you'd expect to see on a winter morning, not in the height of summer. His skin prickled, and his instincts screamed at him to stop, to get off the bike and run. But he couldn't. His body felt disconnected from his mind, his hands frozen to the handlebars, his feet pedaling as if under someone else's command. And then came the whispers. Soft at first, indistinct murmurs that seemed to rise from the ground itself. They grew louder, surrounding him, echoing in a language he didn't understand but instinctively feared. The words felt ancient, filled with malice, like a chant summoning something long buried. Jacob's head darted left and right, desperate to find the source, but there was nothing, no one. Just the forest to his left, the road to his right, and the relentless pull of the bike toward the bottom of the hill. The sun dipped lower, casting the world into a dim twilight. Shadows danced on the edges of his vision, twisting and warping unnaturally. Jacob swore he saw movement among the trees, dark figures darting between the trunks, watching him with unseen eyes. His stomach churned as a new sound emerged, a low guttural growl, like the rumble of a predator stalking its prey. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His gaze snapped forward, and his breath hitched. The barbed wire fence loomed closer, its jagged edges gleaming malevolently in the failing light. It was no longer just a fence. It felt alive, pulsating with a dark energy that made his skin crawl. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic, as if urging him forward, pushing him toward the inevitable. Jacob tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat felt constricted, as if invisible hands were squeezing it shut. The handlebars jerked violently in his grip, nearly pulling him off balance. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure standing by the fence, a silhouette tall and imposing, with glowing eyes that pierced through the twilight. But when he blinked, it was gone. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. Jacob's ears rang, the absence of sound more terrifying than the noise had been. And then he felt it, a hand on his shoulder, firm and cold, as if made of ice. He whipped his head around, but no one was there. The bike began to slow, though Jacob wasn't doing anything to stop it. The resistance felt unnatural, as if an unseen force was holding it back. A single chilling thought pierced through his panic. Something doesn't want me to crash. But what was it? And why? Jacob's mind raced with questions, none of which he wanted to answer. As the bike creaked to an unnatural stop, mere feet from the barbed wire fence, he felt the air shift again. The cold lifted, replaced by an oppressive heat that pressed down on him like a weight. The whispers returned, faint and mocking, as if laughing at his terror. He stumbled off the bike, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. The world around him felt wrong, off-kilter, as though he had stepped into a place he didn't belong. And then, in the suffocating silence, the voice returned, louder this time, filled with a calm authority that made his blood run cold. "Not yet, Jacob," it said. The fence seemed to shimmer, the air around it warping like heat rising from pavement. And for the first time, Jacob felt a deep primal certainty. Whatever had stopped him was not there to save him. It was there to keep him alive, for now. Jacob stood frozen, the echoes of the voice reverberating in his mind like the toll of a distant, ominous bell. "Not yet," it had said, as if it knew something he didn't. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he gripped the handlebars of the rusted bicycle, now eerily still. The barbed wire fence loomed just a few feet away, its sharp edges glinting with a strange, otherworldly light in the dim twilight. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest, each beat a desperate reminder that he was still alive. The silence was deafening now, unnatural and suffocating. Even the crickets and rustling leaves had ceased their evening symphony, as though the entire world was holding its breath. Jacob's instincts screamed at him to run, to abandon the bike and flee back up the hill to the safety of his grandparents' house. Yet his feet remained rooted to the ground, his legs as heavy as stone. Something, an invisible oppressive force, seemed to wrap around him, pinning him in place. He glanced back at the path he had come down, the incline now shrouded in shadow. The forest to his left seemed closer, the dark, gnarled trees pressing in like skeletal sentinels. Their twisted branches stretched outward, reaching for him, or so it seemed. A faint rustling sound emerged from the woods, faint but deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful, like the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching over dry leaves. Jacob's throat tightened as his mind raced with questions. Who, or what, is out there? The rational part of him insisted that it was just an animal, a deer perhaps. But the deeper instinctual part of him, the part that sensed danger before it appeared, knew better. This wasn't a creature of the woods. It was something else, something watching, waiting. The bicycle groaned beneath his touch, the sound breaking the stillness like a sharp crack of thunder. Jacob flinched, his pulse quickening as the oppressive silence seemed to press in even closer. He forced himself to move, his body sluggish and uncooperative. With a trembling hand, he turned the bike around, intending to push it back up the hill. But as he did, the rustling from the woods grew louder, more insistent. Whatever was there was moving closer. Panic surged through him, hot and consuming. He couldn't outrun it, not on foot, not in this state. His eyes darted to the narrow road to his right, the fence marking its edge. If he followed it far enough, maybe he'd reach the safety of a neighboring farm. But even that felt like a gamble. The road stretched into the distance, fading into the shadows, and Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for him there too. A sharp, metallic creak cut through the air. Jacob's gaze snapped to the fence, where the barbed wire seemed to quiver, as though vibrating with an unseen energy. His breath caught in his throat as the shimmer he had noticed earlier intensified, distorting the air around it like a heat mirage. For a brief, horrifying moment, he thought he saw a face reflected in the warped air, a pale, hollow-eyed visage staring back at him with an expression of malice. Fear gripped him like a vice. He had two choices: confront whatever was coming for him from the woods, or continue down the path toward the unknown horrors lurking at the fence. Neither option seemed survivable. His mind raced, weighing the impossible odds, when the voice came again, closer this time, and impossibly clear. "Choose wisely, Jacob," it said, calm and steady, yet laced with an undercurrent of menace. Jacob's chest heaved as he gasped for air, his body trembling with terror. He could feel the presence closing in, surrounding him, though he couldn't see it. The voice had spoken his name with such familiarity, as though it had been following him all his life, waiting for this exact moment. His gaze darted back to the woods, then to the fence, his options narrowing as the darkness pressed in. The bike's wheels creaked, almost beckoning him to ride again. Against every ounce of logic screaming in his mind, he gripped the handlebars and mounted the bike. His legs felt like jelly, his hands slick with sweat, but he pushed off, the bike lurching forward with an unnatural ease. It wasn't just gravity pulling him now, something else was guiding the bike, pushing it down the path, faster and faster. As he rode, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, surrounding him like a swarm. The shadows at the edge of his vision seemed to close in, taking on forms that his mind refused to fully comprehend. He didn't look back, not at the forest, not at the hill. His only focus was on the narrow path ahead, the road, and the shimmering, distorted fence that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. But deep down, Jacob knew, whichever path he chose, he wasn't escaping this. Something had been waiting for him all along, and it was closing in. The air grew heavier, pressing down on Jacob as though the entire weight of the night had descended upon him. The bike sped forward, faster than his legs could have managed, as if it had a will of its own. The narrow path blurred under the fading light, the edges of reality twisting and warping like a dream teetering on the brink of becoming a nightmare. Shadows darted at the periphery of his vision, their movements too fast and erratic to be human. But he knew they were watching him, their unseen eyes burning into his back with a relentless, predatory hunger. Jacob's breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps. The whispers returned, but now they weren't just around him. They were inside him, echoing in the depths of his mind. Their tone was different this time, guttural and ancient, their words dripping with malice and promises of despair. He couldn't understand them, but their meaning was clear. He didn't belong here, and he wasn't supposed to leave. Ahead, the fence came into view again, but it was no longer just a physical barrier. The shimmering distortion that surrounded it had intensified, warping the air until it resembled a veil of liquid glass. It pulsated rhythmically, as though it were alive, its barbed wire edges radiating a cold, pale light that seemed to slice through the darkness. Jacob's stomach churned with dread as he realized the fence wasn't just an obstacle, it was a threshold, a boundary between the world he knew and something far darker, something waiting for him on the other side. And then he saw it. Just beyond the fence, a figure emerged, stepping out of the pulsating distortion like a shadow peeling itself from the darkness. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural, its face a featureless void. Yet Jacob could feel its gaze, piercing, relentless, and full of malice. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and crescendoing into a deafening cacophony as the figure raised one spindly arm and pointed directly at him. The bike shuddered violently beneath him, the handlebars jerking back and forth as though trying to throw him off. Jacob's hands burned as he gripped the metal tightly, his knuckles white with strain. The voice returned, louder than ever, cutting through the whispers like a blade. "Closer, Jacob. Come closer." The figure moved, gliding across the ground without a single sound. It didn't walk, it floated, its dark form bending and contorting as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. The closer it came, the colder the air grew, until Jacob's breath came out in white puffs that dissolved into the oppressive darkness. Jacob's mind screamed at him to stop, to abandon the bike and run back up the hill, but his body refused to obey. His legs pedaled harder, his hands locked on the handlebars, as though something else had taken control. The whispers inside his head became a chant, rhythmic and insistent, drowning out every rational thought. "Cross the threshold. Cross the threshold." The figure reached the fence, its spindly fingers curling around the barbed wire as though it were silk. For a brief, horrifying moment, the pulsating distortion revealed something else: faces. Dozens of them, twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams, pressed against the shimmering veil as though trapped behind glass. Their eyes followed Jacob, pleading with him, warning him, as the figure stepped closer to the fence. Jacob's vision blurred with tears, his chest heaving as panic clawed at his throat. The bike careened toward the fence, the air thick with the stench of rust and decay. The figure raised its other arm, beckoning him forward, its void-like face splitting into a grotesque semblance of a grin. Just as he was about to cross the threshold, something shifted. A flash of light, blinding and pure, erupted from behind him, accompanied by a sound, a deafening resonant hum that vibrated through his very bones. The bike jolted to a stop, throwing Jacob forward onto the ground. He lay there, trembling and gasping for air, as the whispers abruptly ceased. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a suffocating stillness. When Jacob dared to look up, the figure was gone, as was the distortion surrounding the fence. The barbed wire now looked old and rusted, utterly mundane. But the sense of dread remained. He could still feel the presence lingering, watching, waiting. Whatever had stopped him from crossing the threshold wasn't there to save him. It had simply delayed the inevitable. As Jacob pushed himself to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady, a single thought echoed in his mind, a thought that wasn't his own. "Next time, Jacob. Next time." And in the silence that followed, he swore he heard the faintest sound of laughter, dark and mocking, carried on the wind as he stumbled away from the fence. Jacob staggered to his feet, his knees buckling as he glanced at the barbed wire fence now cloaked in an unnerving stillness. The figure was gone, the whispers had ceased, and the suffocating cold had lifted, but the air still buzzed with an unseen tension, as if reality itself was holding its breath. He wiped the sweat from his face with a trembling hand, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. His gaze lingered on the fence, which no longer shimmered or pulsed with an unnatural energy. To the untrained eye, it looked ordinary now, just old, rusted wire strung tightly between wooden posts. Yet Jacob knew better. The image of those tortured faces pressing against the veil haunted him, their silent screams etched into his mind. He couldn't understand what they were trying to tell him, but their terror was palpable, and it was meant for him. The wind picked up, howling softly through the trees like a mournful wail. It carried with it a faint metallic scent, sharp and biting, that clung to the back of Jacob's throat. He turned to the bike, lying twisted on the ground, its rusted chain still vibrating faintly as if something had touched it. For a moment, he considered leaving it there, abandoning the cursed thing. But an inexplicable pull, a whisper in the deepest recesses of his mind, urged him to take it with him. As he bent down to pick up the bike, he noticed something strange. The dirt beneath it was disturbed, not just by the tire tracks but by marks, long claw-like grooves etched into the ground, trailing behind where the bike had come to a stop. They were too large and too deep to belong to any animal Jacob could imagine. He froze, staring at the marks as a cold dread coiled in his stomach. The world around him seemed to dim, the edges of his vision growing hazy as the silence stretched on. And then he heard it, a low guttural growl, so deep it felt as though it were vibrating through the ground beneath him. Jacob's head snapped up, his eyes darting to the dark forest that loomed on the left side of the path. Something moved between the trees, a shadow too large and too fast to be human. The growl came again, closer this time, reverberating through the thick air. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he backed away from the forest, dragging the bike with him. His movements were clumsy, his limbs sluggish as though he were wading through water. The unseen presence in the woods seemed to grow stronger, its oppressive weight pressing against him with every step he took. And then, just as he thought he might make it back up the hill, the voice returned. "Jacob," it called, clear and calm yet filled with a terrifying authority. It didn't sound like it came from the forest or the fence. It sounded as though it came from everywhere at once, surrounding him, invading his mind. "You've seen it now. You can't go back." The word sent a chill racing down Jacob's spine, his legs trembling beneath him. His instincts screamed at him to keep moving, but the voice continued, louder now, resonating with an otherworldly power. "It waits for you. You belong to it." Jacob turned, his eyes locking onto the fence. It shimmered faintly again, as if responding to the voice, its barbs glinting like teeth in the pale moonlight. He felt drawn to it, a magnetic pull that defied all logic and reason. The faces returned, faint but visible, their mouths moving in desperate pleas that he couldn't hear. His mind reeled as he struggled to piece together what he was seeing. The fence wasn't just a barrier, it was a gateway, a thin veil separating his world from something far darker. The figure, the voices, the faces, they were all tied to whatever lay beyond. And now that he had come this close, there was no escaping it. The voice echoed again, softer this time, almost soothing. "You were chosen, Jacob. It will find you, when the time is right." Jacob's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, clutching the dirt as the weight of the revelation sank in. He had thought the bike stopping had saved him, that the force pulling him back was an act of mercy. But now he realized the truth. It wasn't mercy, it was patience. The figure hadn't wanted him to cross the threshold, not yet. But one day, when the conditions were right, it would return for him. The barbed wire fence wasn't just a gateway, it was a trap, baited and waiting for the next victim to come too close. Jacob scrambled to his feet, the urgency to leave overtaking every other thought. He abandoned the bike, leaving it as a relic of the terror he'd just endured. As he stumbled back up the hill, his legs burning with exertion, he swore he could feel the presence still watching him, its unseen gaze heavy on his back. When he finally reached the top of the hill, the air was lighter, the oppressive dread lifting slightly. But as Jacob turned to look one last time at the path below, he froze. The fence no longer shimmered, the faces were gone, and the figure had disappeared. Yet the claw-like grooves in the dirt remained, stark and undeniable evidence of what he had experienced. Jacob knew then that he hadn't escaped. He had only delayed the inevitable. And as he walked away, the faint sound of laughter drifted on the wind, low and mocking, a chilling reminder that this was far from over. Jacob didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his grandparents' house, the old wooden structure glowing faintly in the dim light of the porch lantern. The warm light should have been comforting, but tonight, it felt fragile, like a flickering candle in the middle of a storm. His breath came in ragged gasps as he collapsed against the front steps, his legs too weak to carry him any further. Inside, the house was unnervingly quiet, the ticking of an old clock echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. Jacob hesitated before entering, his instinct screaming that whatever had followed him from the fence might have already made its way inside. But when he pushed the door open, the warm scent of baking bread and the familiar creak of the floorboards greeted him. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe he was safe. His grandparents, sitting in the dim glow of a single lamp, looked up at him with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," his grandfather said with a weak chuckle, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Jacob opened his mouth to explain, to pour out the nightmarish series of events he had just endured, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain the unnatural force at the fence? The figure, the voices, the faces? Instead, he muttered something about the bike and being spooked in the woods. His grandmother reached for his hand, her touch warm and grounding, but even that couldn't dispel the chill that had settled deep into his bones. "It's late," she said softly. "Get some rest. Things will look clearer in the morning." But Jacob knew there was no clarity waiting for him in the light of day. The fence, the figure, the ominous voice, they weren't figments of his imagination. He could feel the truth pressing down on him, as heavy and suffocating as the air near that cursed threshold. That night, as he lay in the old creaky bed upstairs, the house seemed alive with sounds he couldn't place. The wind outside howled like a mournful wail, rattling the windows and setting the old beams groaning. Shadows stretched and danced across the walls, twisting into shapes that seemed too deliberate to be random. Sleep eluded him, his mind replaying every moment by the fence, every chilling whisper and mocking laugh. Just as he began to drift into an uneasy sleep, a faint sound broke the silence, a metallic creak, faint and distant, like the groan of rusted wire shifting under pressure. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound came again, louder this time, unmistakable. It was the fence. Jacob sat up, his breath shallow and his skin cold with sweat. He turned his gaze to the window, the curtains barely moving in the faint breeze. For a moment, he debated whether to look, to confirm his growing fear. Slowly, he crept toward the window, each creak of the floorboards beneath his feet echoing like thunder in the silent house. He pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. At first, there was nothing but darkness, the sprawling fields illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. But then, at the far edge of the property, he saw it, a faint shimmer, like heat rising from the earth. The fence. It pulsed faintly, the same unnatural light he had seen before, its barbs catching the moonlight like sharp teeth. And then, a shadow moved. Jacob's breath caught as the figure stepped into view, tall and impossibly thin, its movements unnaturally smooth. It stood still for a moment, its featureless face turned directly toward the house. Toward him. His heart raced as the figure raised one spindly arm, pointing toward the window. Toward Jacob. He stumbled back, the curtain falling shut as he collapsed onto the floor. The voice echoed in his mind again, calm and cold, its words clear as day. "You can't hide, Jacob. It's only a matter of time." The next morning, the world outside looked bright and ordinary, as if the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare. But the claw-like marks in the dirt near the fence were still there, and Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He avoided the bike, the path, and especially the fence, but the presence never left him. Even years later, the memories lingered. Jacob never returned to that farm, and he never spoke of what happened to anyone. But the whispers still came sometimes in the dead of night, reminding him that the fence, the figure, and the darkness beyond hadn't forgotten him. And though he tried to push it to the back of his mind, a single thought haunted him: one day it will come back for me. And in the stillness of those nights, Jacob swore he could still hear the faint, mocking laughter drifting through the air, as though the figure was biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to call him back to the threshold he had barely escaped. Years later, Jacob still couldn't fully escape the grip of that fateful evening. Life moved forward, as it always does, but the memories refused to fade. They clung to him like shadows in the corners of his mind, always there, always watching. At first, he tried to convince himself it had been a trick of the light, his imagination running wild on that rural farm. But no rational explanation could account for the voice, the figure, or the unshakable sense that something had reached out to him from beyond the veil of reality. He moved to the city, hoping the bustling streets and constant noise would drown out the lingering whispers that sometimes returned in the dead of night. For a time, It seemed to work. The brightness of the city lights and the ceaseless hum of activity made the events of that summer feel like a distant nightmare. Yet, in the quiet hours when sleep refused to come, Jacob would feel it again, that presence lingering just out of sight. The whispers were the first to return. Faint at first, like a distant wind rustling through unseen trees. They grew louder over time, taking on that same guttural otherworldly tone that had haunted him on the path to the fence. They didn't speak in words, but their meaning was clear, a warning, a reminder, and perhaps a threat. He learned to keep his apartment well lit at night, as though the shadows might take shape if given the chance. But no amount of light could banish the memories. The barbed wire fence appeared in his dreams, always shimmering with that unnatural energy, always beckoning him closer. The faces pressed against the veil returned, their silent screams filling his subconscious with dread. The figure was always there too, standing just beyond the threshold, its featureless void of a face fixed on him. One night, Jacob dreamed he was back on the path, the bike creaking beneath him as it carried him downhill. The figure waited by the fence, its long spindly arms stretched outward as if to embrace him. The voice spoke again, calm and deliberate, cutting through the oppressive silence. "It's time, Jacob. Come home." He woke in a cold sweat, the sound of his name echoing in his ears. The clock on his nightstand read 3:07 a.m., but the oppressive sense of dread made it impossible to stay in bed. He got up, pacing the small apartment, his mind racing. He glanced toward the window, half expecting to see the figure standing in the street below, pointing up at him. But the city seemed still, almost too still, as if the world were holding its breath. Jacob's thoughts drifted back to the faces in the fence. He had spent countless hours trying to decipher their meaning. Were they warnings? Trapped souls? Or worse, victims? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. What if the fence wasn't just a gateway to another realm? What if it was a snare, and the figure was its hunter, waiting patiently for its next prey? As the years passed, Jacob became increasingly paranoid. Every unexplained creak, every flicker of a street lamp, every shadow that moved too quickly sent a shiver down his spine. The figure never appeared in the waking world, but its presence was always there, lingering at the edges of his reality. He avoided remote areas, old paths, and especially fences. But deep down, he knew it didn't matter. The voice came less frequently, but when it did, it was always the same message. Not yet, Jacob. Not yet. One evening, Jacob received a call from a distant relative. His grandparents had passed away, and the family farm was being sold. They invited him to visit one last time, to say goodbye to the place where he had spent so many childhood summers. The invitation filled him with an inexplicable dread. He hadn't set foot on that property since the night of the bike ride, and the thought of returning made his chest tighten with fear. But something deeper stirred within him, a compulsion he couldn't ignore. The fence, the figure, the voices, they had all started there, and perhaps they would end there. Against his better judgment, he agreed to go. When he arrived, the farm looked much the same as it had all those years ago. The barn still stood, weathered and sagging under the weight of time. The path remained, cutting through the field like a scar. And at the far edge of the property, the fence waited, rusted and worn but still intact. As he approached it, his heart pounded in his chest. The air grew colder, the familiar oppressive weight pressing down on him. The fence shimmered faintly in the twilight, its barbs glinting with an eerie light. Jacob stopped several feet away, his body trembling. The figure emerged, stepping through the veil as if it had been waiting for him all along. It was taller now, more defined, its elongated limbs moving with a grotesque fluidity. The void where its face should have been seemed to pull at him, drawing him closer. The voice spoke once more, its tone final and inescapable. "It's time." Jacob stood frozen, torn between terror and an inexplicable pull to step forward. He realized, then, that this was always going to happen. The fence wasn't just a gateway, it was a conclusion. The figure hadn't forgotten him. It had been waiting. And as the whispers rose around him, Jacob took a step closer, knowing that whatever lay beyond the threshold would finally claim him.